Our first respondent is the Excellency Ambassador Geratu. Now, interestingly enough, the point the governor made about China and its path, and I think this is what you'll find that's common to people who have developed successfully, self-determination. Now, the question is, at this point in time, do we have self-determination? Well, I'll tell you this. Eritrea and the ambassador personally have been very, very focused on charting a course of economic development that is basically self-designed. Eritrea, in contrast to a lot of similar countries that have come out of similar situations, eschews foreign aid. They look away from foreign aid for private sector investment. According to the US Department of State, Office of Foreign Assistance, Eritrea is the only African country that did not request aid from the US for the fiscal year 2011. I'm not sure if it's the only one, but certainly the only one in any similar sort of circumstances. So, and the reduced level of foreign aid, as opposed to investment, corresponds to reduced levels of foreign influence. Now, of course, we're not here saying foreign influence is necessarily a bad thing if it suits the purposes of what we want, self-determination. So these reduced levels of foreign aid mean that the Eritrean experience has been largely charting a course of economic development that is self-designed. So I want to hear what the ambassador has to say, and then in terms of both our overall topic, but his own personal experience in terms of Eritrea and its path to development. Ambassador, please.
Thank you, China, for the kind introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers of this panel discussion as well. It's a timely discussion. And thank you also the Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria for giving an insight, an overall insight into the situation in Africa in relation to Nigeria's experience. I like the conclusion. Africa should be, African markets should be for Africa. And I do concur with this idea, but I'll base myself on the experience of Eritrea to discuss the central theme of this deliberation. Neither the Washington nor the Beijing consensus. I don't like this title, to be honest, because it leads to a certain perception, and it leads to a perception about the importance of development models. And I am against development models, and Eritrea doesn't subscribe to any development models. I might agree with some of those science and engineering experts here, because in certain phenomena and products or whatever, you could talk about models. But to take society and the development and transformation of societies in terms of models had been and is going to be one of the most important dangers in the future development and discourse. So let's forget about development models. And as the governor mentioned, there is diversity. Diversity in all sense and in all ways. I don't believe that the German economy is very similar to the UK economy. There are experiences, despite being in a capitalist formation, I don't think they are very similar. And I don't think we could take China as a single economic system. It's diverse in itself within China. So it's very fair for us if we are to at least discuss and create a unity of thinking and praxis in terms of the future of Africa and its development. It's better not to talk about models, including development models. That's how we see it in Eritrea. So I have taken development models as myth rather than reality. When we talk about development models, when we talk about the development of Africa and development of Eritrea, the essence has been always taken as transformation and change for development. I was very happy to hear the governor mentioning about diversity in African countries. And in order to see the macro level interpretation of development that we are trying to pursue in Eritrea, I will try to highlight four important parameters in order to redefine the development path that we are trying to develop in Eritrea. One is we need to agree on the decisiveness of the internal dynamics, whether for Eritrea or for any African country or Africa at large. This is not to negate the importance of external factors, external parameters, external influence, or external relations. But this is where we have gone wrong in Africa, in post-independent Africa in the last 6-7 decades. The second issue is the question of relevance. If we believe in the internal dynamics, then what is relevant to Africa? So when we talk about development, in whatever form it comes, it has to be related to the context, needs of today, tomorrow, and for generations to come in Africa. And lastly, it has to be related to the human betterment issues of Africa. That should come as a priority in terms of development. The third issue is we need to think in terms of essence of development in its entirety, the all-round development of an African nation. And the fourth is the decisiveness, I will underline this, the decisiveness of the human factor in change, transformation, and overall development of Eritrea. Of course, as has been mentioned by the governor earlier, the decisiveness of the human factor will definitely depend on the knowledge, skills, professional and technical capabilities, and above all, attitude, because development, change, transformation requires commitment and sacrifice. And that's what we need in terms of trying to create the decisiveness of the human factor. Now, this leads to another important issue. In Eritrea, whenever we talk about the development context, we take into consideration two dimensions of our reality, which is the reality in Africa as well. The first issue is the essence of development in Africa is about nation building, the process of nation building. Nation building in Africa has not so far been consummated adequately and properly. And that's why we see so many problems in different parts of Africa. Conflicts, dependency, many other issues. So the first aspect of the reality that has to be addressed as a way of trying to chart the future course of Africa, of Eritrea, is to see how nation building could be approached. Of course, the low level of socioeconomic development in Africa has been a constraint. We have been struggling to come out of that situation. Many progress has been achieved, but still we haven't consummated that nation building process. I would raise an important issue now in terms of nation building, which is becoming an obstacle to the overall development orientation in our countries. Have we been able to create viable states? That's one question. Have we been able to create sound economies in Africa, as the governor has been mentioning, even from the experience of Nigeria, the biggest economy in Africa? And have we created a viable future in Africa? If we take this into consideration, so the biggest part of our reality, the important part or dimension of our reality is nation building, and I'll see how we are trying to address, we will see how we are going to address in Eritrea the nation building process when I come to the practical, pragmatic issues of development. But there is another aspect to this reality. In the present world order, I will not speak as a diplomat now. In the present world order, especially in the world order that Africa has been faced after independence, geopolitical agendas and interests, and especially economic interests, have been at the helm of the influence of the development of Africa. I don't think we need to be complacent about this. If we don't take this into consideration, even for the future, it would be very difficult to address the major tenets of nation building with all the parameters that I mentioned, internal dynamics, the decisiveness of our human factor, and so on and so on. It will be very difficult. I'm not going to go deep into economic parameters and issues and so on, because the governor has dwelt on that, and I'm not an economist, so I don't know the technical language very much. But the crux of the matter is geopolitical agendas and interests, especially economic interests, are a reality in this world. And that has a great influence in the development of Africa, and for that matter, in the development of all developing countries. We know the Cold War situation. The Cold War situation and the ideologies. The development model is capitalist, socialist, and now state-led economic system. The alliances created as a result of this. The shifting alliances between different powers and different countries, and the impact of that in Africa. Ethiopia, Somalia could be taken a typical example of this, and how that affected the development of these countries. Even after the Cold War situation, this hasn't stopped. We don't have a Cold War, but de facto we could say that there is, because there are these geopolitical agendas and influences and interests. Well, of course, it's very important to mention also, when we talk about the development of Africa, the influence, and even to a certain extent, the threats that globalization, world economic integration, as well as the rapid ICT transformation, which is creating digital divide between the North and South. And Africa has been the most marginalized in terms of this digital divide. So this should also be taken into consideration in light of the practical, pragmatic measures that we want to employ in the development of Eritrea. With this background, now I'll go to what viable future do we have in Eritrea and in Africa, and how should development be addressed? And therefore, I will go to the modest experience of Eritrea. From the outset, I would like to mention honestly that what people know about Eritrea, however scanty the information that they have, is only related to the perceived image created by certain corners and media institutions and in general ideological apparatuses of certain countries. It's completely different from the real image of the country. I'll come to that point later on. When I talk about the pragmatic approach of development in Eritrea, I'm not talking about a new model, because it's not something that Eritrea created by miracle. What we have tried to do is learn from the experiences of the national liberation struggle, where against all odds, we have been able to survive with resilience and achieve independence, and use that drive as the approach for the nation-building process in Eritrea. The development path in Eritrea is based on independent stance. There are 3 dimensions to this independent stance and development path in Eritrea. And that is, 1, owning our own decision. Owning our own decision. And we believe that at this time, Africa needs to own its own decision. There are a lot of issues that could come into play in this discussion. Of course, this is not to negate the importance of cooperation, meaningful cooperation in all sorts. But at the end of the day, if we are to build a new nation, if the nation-building process is to be consummated in Eritrea, we need to own our own decision. That's why I was mentioning about all these geopolitics agendas and interests earlier. And we have to have the gut to say no when it is contrary to our national interests. So owning our own decisions for the sake of the national interest and build genuine cooperation. And when it comes to genuine cooperation, Eritrea's belief has been and will continue to be our joint survival in Africa at large, and in particular in the Horn of Africa, will greatly depend on the harmonization of our efforts in that region. Complementariness, sound cooperation, and peaceful coexistence. That's the only way that we could survive in this era of globalization with all its goods and bads. The greater world economic integration that is taking place, and including the ICT rapid transformation that I mentioned earlier. So when we own our own decision, however, the political process of nation building itself, as a way of trying to promote social justice in the country, has to be the predominant feature. Because owning own decision in the first place has to translate into equal and balanced development within Eritrea, taking into consideration the diverse composition and unequal development that has prevailed for centuries in the society. Well, of course, sometimes when we talk about owning our own decision, some interpret it as isolation and talk about, Eritrea has to open its space to the outside world and so on. We are open. But the question is, we paid sacrifice to bring independence in Eritrea. It was a huge sacrifice, decades of war. We lost opportunity cost. We almost inherited a devastated economy below zero, a destabilized social fabrics. So with all the sacrifice that has been paid, with all the hundreds of thousands of martyrs in the liberation struggle, the biggest responsibility that we have to our martyrs is to never compromise on our national unity, national interest, and the building of the future generation of Eritrea. So we believe that emancipation of Eritrea, emancipation of Africa, lies first and foremost on owning our own decisions. The second is economic liberation and the accompanying strategy of self-reliance. We believe aid is not a solution. Despite the generous flow of aid in the last 6-7 decades into Africa, it hasn't produced any result. We haven't seen any solution. In fact, there is now a talk about making aid effective. We can't make aid effective. Aid is a system of thinking, system of practice, system of organization, and you can't make aid effective. What's needed is a paradigm shift from aid and move into other aspects of relationships. So, China was mentioning about Eritrea not requesting aid in the fiscal year 2011, but this has been going on for many years. We haven't got any aid from the United States since 2003. So it's not only about 2011. And this has been an established policy, and it will continue to be an established policy, because from the experience of the liberation struggle and the experiences of our African brothers, that's what we have learned. And this should be taken as an important value. Sometimes, very recently, a certain politician was talking to me. Suppose if the UK wants to give you £25 million, you are going to refuse that money? It's not about money. It's not about money. We have got 21 million US dollars in grant from China. But we have been doing that project through our own resources, being self-reliant, by mobilizing our local resource, organizing it, harnessing it as a capacity. And if somebody comes to pour something into what we have done, that's not aid. The question is, aid with all its conditionalities and stringent measures, and in most cases to be implemented by NGOs which create parallel structures, doesn't help development. And for your information, after 1995, we do not have international NGOs in Eritrea. The important correlation with promoting self-reliance as a strategy in Eritrea, however, is we are open to promote partnerships for mutual benefit, for mutual interest, and for mutual understanding. And this within the limits of our capacity. We are doing it. Of course, there is scope for improving that, which we will be committed to do in our future engagements and development. The third aspect is own your own decision, self-reliance, and the third important issue is nation building can only be consummated if we could create national capacity. This will involve many, many different aspects. One of the most important issues in the creation of national capacity is to create a capacity that will enable us to structurally transform the economy, and in particular to structurally transform the agricultural sector, which is the backbone of the economy. We believe, however, in creating national capacity, as we require science, technology, capital flow, investment would be required. And Eritrea's experience in terms of investment is, yes, foreign direct investment is very crucial for transferring capital, transferring technology, and creation of employment, which has a multiplier effect in terms of the creation of wealth, which we are seeing in the most elementary way at this time, because we are a new country, the foreign direct investment success in Eritrea can only be achieved if we are able to create domestic capital and domestic investment as part of the national capacity building. So this is another aspect that has to be learned in Africa, creating domestic capital, domestic investment. In terms of attracting foreign direct investment, we have moved ahead in the last 10 years. Of course, there are a lot of hostilities. We had several challenges, especially, as has been mentioned earlier. We have been working to expand the economic infrastructure in the country. Still, we have a long way to go. We have been working to promote human capital formation through aggressive reform in our education system, human resource development endeavors, but still we have a long way to go. But nevertheless, we have tried to establish the basic foundation for attracting foreign direct investment, and it's paying its dividend at this time. So while we understand that it's very competitive to attract foreign direct investment, and for that matter, the percentage of foreign direct investment flow to Africa is still very, very low. I think 5.3, maybe you could correct me, in 2010. It has improved from 2005, which was about 0.7%. It has been decreasing from 2008, from about 72 billion US dollars to about 50 to 52 billion dollars in 2010. But nevertheless, there has been some increase, but it's still very, very low. It's very low in comparison to the overall investment flow to other parts of the world. So, and especially those poorer countries have been marginalized in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. Now, this takes us to the issue of first building capacity through domestic capital, through domestic investment, and at the same time look for South-to-South cooperation, because about half of the foreign direct investment globally is coming from these emerging economies and some developing countries, and South-to-South investment flow has become very prominent in the last decade. So we have to look for such avenues in terms of attracting investment. So African development, Eritrean development, has to base on these three aspects in order to consummate the nation-building process and achieve sustainable growth. The fundamental experiences that I see here is the need of an independent stance within the dynamics of the political process of a nation-building process, because that's very vital for promoting social justice, which could create important dividends in terms of peace and stability. And that's why Eritrea enjoys peace and stability despite many challenges and problems. The second issue is the diversification of the economy is another experience that we see in Eritrea. Of course, we know that Eritrea is sitting, 67% of the Eritrean land is in some sort of minerals. We know that mining sector could play an important part in the overall national development, but we don't want to depend on the mining sector only. So it's about diversifying the economy, look at how we could exploit the comparative advantage that we have, maximize their utilization, and then sustain growth and development. The third area is the structural transformation of the economy. Structural transformation would be very important at macro level and even at lower levels To give you an example, agricultural has been the target of structural transformation in Eritrea. We are resorting to irrigation agriculture and irrigation technology. We have been able to go into conservation of water and soil extensively. And as a result of this, agricultural productivity has increased in Eritrea. And despite the famine that has been looming in the Horn of Africa in the last 2 years, there is no famine in Eritrea, contrary to what you hear in BBC or CNN or from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. The fourth experience is the need to emphasize the creation of human capital. Proactive policies, as mentioned by the governor, and mobilization. Mobilization, in particular, the mobilization of the Eritrean diaspora communities to play a significant part in national development. So this is what's happening in Eritrea. But Eritrea has been the target of all these hostilities and threats in the last 10 years. The policy is not accepted. Our pragmatic approach to development, especially in all these three aspects that I mentioned, has not been accepted. There has been failed efforts and conspiracies to destabilize the country. And even when all these conspiracies and efforts to destabilize the country failed, in the pretext of Somalia and in the pretext of supporting Al-Shabaab, which is unwarranted, unsubstantiated, sanction was imposed on Eritrea as a way of trying to block the economic development of Eritrea. The economic development of Eritrea, despite all these hostilities and threats, including the war, the border war with Ethiopia, has shown resilience, and this resilience has paid its dividend, and the Eritrean economy has grown significantly. I don't want to go into the details, but we were hearing from Chatham House and the International Crisis Group about the Eritrean economy collapsing in 2010, but what we heard in 2011 was that Eritrea is going to be one of the fastest growing economies in the next 3 to 5 years. And even forecasting about 17.3% annual economic growth, overpassing Qatar. That might be music to my ears. Whatever the percentage is, definitely the Eritrean economy has shown resilience despite all these hostilities and threats, because we worked to diversify the economy and be self-reliant by mobilizing our local resources and create the necessary national capacity. So I will conclude, because I don't have time to go into the last part. I will conclude with a very interesting quotation from Thomas Kennedy. I'm sure many of you know him, the author of Auschwitz, and he wrote a book on Eritrea, which is called, which under the title Towards Asmara. He visited the liberation struggle in 1988, and having visited all aspects of the development during the liberation struggle, where all these policies and pragmatic approaches were implemented, this is what he had to say in his book. Do you know what the emergency really is? You wanted to hear about the really big emergency. The emergency is that if you guys, Eritreans, succeed using your principles of self-reliance, you will be an embarrassment to Africa. Who wants a setup like yours? There aren't many governments on this continent that do. There aren't many governments in Europe, colored folk, who can look after themselves. It is not viable. It upsets the world picture. Don't you know the West has to believe famine is an act of God? If they believe that, they only have to make a donation. But if they believe it's an act of bloody politics, they have to really do something. And that's too complicated. So what is the story? The story is you guys will fall on your own swords because you have got this crazy idea that the world will allow you to be perfect. These guys, Eritreans, are astounding, running all this. And you know what? The world hates them only for it. The world hooked into the idea of these helpless Africans. You know what I think? They are brave to the point of folly, and they are clever to the point of dumb. No one, absolutely no one, from Washington to Moscow, wants them to succeed. No one. God has even taken the reign away from them, for Christ's sake. Even he thinks they are wrong-headed. The sin of pride, the sin of being sharp, when no one wants them to be. Thank you.
Brave to the point of folly and clever to the point of dumb. I think that's a fascinating quotation which could be applied to some people that we know. I'm going to move on to our second respondent, but just to quickly say that we're going to have some interactive dialogue amongst the panel, so I'll reserve certain questions, such as the question of whether development models are in fact myth. I'm sure Professor Collier will have some things to say on that. But just to touch on the common points between what the governor said and what the ambassador said in terms of what we need to do in Africa. Again, similar themes, obviously very, very different contexts, different countries. But what we're talking about is owning our own decisions, self-determination, cooperation, self-reliance, harnessing capacity, nation building, and you could look at that as continent building as well. Very common themes. And I think these things apply across the continent. Despite the huge variety of cultures and contexts, I think these are themes that apply to most of our fellow African nations.